We should begin our discussion, I think, of the history with the earliest times, which stretch back before the written record to the time of your Illyrians and beyond. So here's where the work of the archaeologists really comes in. And just what are the central findings of their research about genocide in humans prehistory?
Okay, so no, go ahead, finish what you were going to say.
Genocide in our prehistory.
Okay. So again, I'm far from an expert on prehistory, right? But I think the thing to say is that, and I've already said it in some ways, is there's a lot we don't know, right? There's a lot we don't know. And you can only speculate a little bit about it. For example, people have speculated about Homo sapiens having committed genocide against Neanderthals. In other words, that this was a different people, a different way of looking at tribes or groups of people who lived together. And that there were, a lot of people have talked about the intersection of the two. In other words, we know, for example, from all this new genetic stuff, right, that not everybody, but a lot of people are part Neanderthal. I'm part Neanderthal, right?
But rape is a big part of genocide.
Yeah. So, there was a lot of interaction, obviously, between these groups. But other people have suggested, given the remains in caves, that Homo sapiens had engaged in a kind of murderous campaign against groups. Again, group is important, of Neanderthals. So in prehistory, it's likely that some warlike situations, rival clans, tribes, it's almost, you can't call them tribes, but that's what I'm calling them, engaged in genocidal actions against each other. And that, groups of peoples were eliminated. And again, we know from cave dwelling kinds of things that, from graves that they've uncovered in caves, that there was mass murder, and that this mass murder took place, under much smaller scale, but you could probably call it genocide. I would be very tentative. I hope in my book I was very tentative about this. It's now been several years since I wrote the book, but I feel very tentative about answering a question like that, because there's just so much we don't know, and there's so much that's still being discovered. And there's an interesting tendency. As I mentioned to you, I did a little bit of reading on this recently. There is a kind of tendency to, I think, to idealize prehistory. That the fault, as it were, with mankind is modernization, and modern man is the be all and end all of evil in this world. And there's something in us all that want to kind of make these primitive tribes more humane. And I think that's probably a mistake. I think that probably there was a lot of elimination of different groups. But again, I'm not a specialist, and it won't be. There's certain fields I know where I have to rely on others. I won't do that work myself. So that's what I would say about prehistory, is that it's hard to know what happened exactly. We have these stories. I think I told them a little bit in the book from the Bible, about the Hebrews, and this would be 12,000 BC or something like that, and 13,000, where the rabbis are sort of saying what happened, right? And the rabbis in the 6th and 7th century are saying, well, what happened back then to the earliest Hebrews? They can't know either, right? When they're writing essentially the Old Testament, they can't know what happened. But there's stories that come through the generations, and they recapitulate those stories. And in those stories that they tell, there is genocide, which means that they know about genocide, that they can conceive of genocide, that maybe it even's happening around them, when they're doing this writing. So, who knows?
Mm-hmm. Maybe I shouldn't have been, but I was actually very surprised. It was probably the most surprising thing to me in the book to read that the Old Testament is a major source of historical record for the early history of the genocide. And my surprise probably stems from a basic prejudice that is suspect of religious writings. But I was also surprised to see that the Iliad, and maybe more the Iliad than the Odyssey, but the Iliad also factored into your historical interpretation.
Yeah, no, I mean, look, historians, talk about their objectivity. They try to be objective modern historians. I mean, nobody wants to distort the past or to make it into something that it wasn't. And it's very hard sometimes to, reconstruct the past in its absolute objectivity. In fact, it's impossible. So, but there are historians. I mean, Herodotus was one of the most famous, there were three-headed monsters and there were this and there were, and he's considered one of the father of history, along with Thucydides. Thucydides was tried to be more objective, but, somebody like Herodotus is, telling stories that he hears. And it's a little bit like the rabbis who are telling stories in the Old Testament, about what they hear and what they see and what they've noted down over the centuries. So it's a wonderful source, I think, the Old Testament, for thinking about, what, not so much what went on as what was going on then as when they were writing. Because again, as I said, they can conceive of mass murder. I cited these various passages from Deuteronomy, having to do with the Amalekites and the Hebrews' attack on the Amalekites. And, you read that and you see that it has the quality of verisimilitude. Now, did the Hebrews really kill off the Amalekites? Well, it's hard to prove now, and, there've been plenty of, this story of Joshua and the Battle of Jericho, and the walls came tumbling down. Well, and then Joshua ended up killing all the people in Jericho, the Amalekites who lived there, and taking the women off as slaves. Archaeologists have been digging around Jericho forever, trying to figure out, what happened in Jericho? Did anything happen in Jericho? Was Joshua really there or not? And it's hard to figure it out. They've got some evidence, but not others. And mostly it looks like mythology. But mythology has certain bases in fact. And, a discreet historian, someone who doesn't exaggerate what they're reading or doesn't make mountains out of molehills, to put it into everyday language, you can get a lot from sources like that, and from the Iliad, and from, like I said, from Herodotus too, who is a myth maker. I mean, he made myths as well as in writing history. Well, and some of us today also do mythologies, and we have our own mythologies, that we pass on as historians. And some of those mythologies, need to be punctured too. But as long as you don't go overboard with it, you're trying to reconstruct the past as best you can and understand what happened, then, you're doing your job.
Yeah, and even if it's hard to prove, like you said, that the Hebrews killed the Amalekites, it remains amazing. The same sorts of justifications, like divine right, for instance, are cited in the genocidal aspirations of the past, which at least lends very strong credence to Lemkin's thesis that genocide occurs in all times and places, regardless of whether the prehistorical facts are, in fact, factual.
No, that's right. And I mean, we know, for example, I don't think I talk about this in the book at all, but we know from primatology that apes, our closest relatives, don't commit genocide. They'll fight border wars. They have hierarchical wars, where the the alpha males will kind of change places and they'll fight to the death, to achieve that new height. But they don't attack other groups of apes and kill them. Only human beings do that. And human beings, as best we can figure out, have done it from the beginning of time. I mean, from the beginning of human history. And, one of the reasons, the past and the present have an unusual relationship to each other. They're not independent of each other. I mean, sometimes people think history is a kind of this abstract chronicle of the past, right? That you can somehow reconstruct in its wholeness. You can't do that. You're always picking and choosing, right? The grandfather historian was named von Ranke, Leopold von Ranke, and he said, I'm writing history wie es eigentlich gewesen ist, meaning I'm reading history the way it happened. I'm writing history the way it happened. I mean, he claimed he knew the way the history happened. And of course, you don't know that. He's writing history the way he sees it from his point of view, in the 1890s and the beginning of the 20th century, right? And he's got his point of view, von Ranke, late 19th century point of view. And, that point of view, just like we have our point of view, and we're writing, it's constantly interacting. So what I'm trying to say is you not only learn about the present from the past, you learn about the past from the present. So, if you have a case, or you have cases we know about where peoples attack other peoples and murder them all, you can go back and read Deuteronomy and you say, wait a minute, that's perfectly logical and reasonable, given what we've seen that's happened. I mean, you don't create one from the other, but the two have to talk to each other. And that way you understand the phenomenon, the historical phenomenon.